Is your boss good in an emergency? I was cleaning Josh's teeth when I noticed his eyes rolling back in his head and my stomach dropped. He'd just gotten back from deployment 2 weeks ago and was showing me videos of his 4-year-old tackling him at the airport, and now he might have been making her an orphan. I ran to Dr. Stevens and told him we needed to call 911, but he laughed and said Josh was just having dental anxiety, and veterans get panic attacks all the time in dental chairs. Josh raised his right hand to his head, but his left arm stayed dead on the armrest, and when he tried to say his daughter's name, it came out as gibberish. Stevens leaned over him and said loudly and slowly, like Josh was stupid, that everything was fine, and dental anxiety makes people feel strange sensations. I said we needed to call an ambulance right now because I thought he was having a stroke, but Stevens pulled me into the hallway and said if I called 911 and disrupted his practice over a panic attack, he'd fire and report me for practicing medicine without a license. I went back to Josh and his eyes were full of tears, but only the right side of his face could cry, and he kept trying to say something about his daughter, but the words wouldn't come out right. Stevens came back with the anesthetic needle saying once Josh was numb, he'd calm down, and I knew if he gave a local anesthetic to someone mid-stroke, it could complicate everything. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911 while Stevens screamed at me to hang up immediately, and I told the dispatcher we had a 32-year-old male patient presenting with facial droop, slurred speech, and left side paralysis. Stevens tried to grab my phone and kept yelling that I was creating unnecessary panic over a veteran with PTSD having a completely normal trauma response to dental work. Josh was trying to get out of the chair, but his left leg wouldn't work, and he looked at me with this pure terror in his eyes because he knew what was happening even if Stevens wouldn't admit it. The dispatcher said paramedics were 3 minutes out, and Stevens said those 3 minutes would cost me my entire career because he'd make sure everyone knew I was a hysteric who traumatized patients. Josh's breathing got weird and raspy, and he managed to get out the word Bella, which was his daughter's name, and it broke my heart because he knew he might never see her again. Stevens was still trying to proceed with the root canal, saying Josh needed to stop being dramatic and that plenty of patients had anxiety, but Josh's eyes started rolling back. I held Josh's hand and kept talking to him about Bella and how she needed her daddy to come home from this appointment too, and Stevens was on the phone with his lawyer asking about liability if a rogue employee called emergency services without authorization. Josh squeezed my hand with his right hand, but the left side of his body was completely limp and his breathing was getting shallower. Stevens came back and said he'd documented everything, and when Josh was fine in 10 minutes, I'd be paying for the ambulance call and losing my license. The sirens were getting closer, but Josh's skin was turning gray, and I kept thinking about that video of Bella jumping into his arms at the airport, how she'd wrapped her tiny legs around him and wouldn't let go. Stevens was actually prepping the dental dam for the root canal while Josh was dying in the chair, saying if we just proceeded with treatment, Josh would realize he was fine. I put my fingers on Josh's wrist and his pulse was all wrong, too fast then too slow, and he wasn't responding when I said his name. The paramedics burst in, and Stevens immediately started telling them this was unnecessary and Josh just had dental anxiety, but they took one look at Josh and started working on him frantically. They were shouting medical terms I didn't understand and putting oxygen on him while Stevens stood there saying he didn't consent to treatment in his facility, and one paramedic told him to shut up or get out. They got Josh on their gurney, but he wasn't moving at all anymore, just this awful stillness, and I heard one paramedic say something about the golden hour already being passed. Stevens was screaming that when Josh was fine, he'd sue me for everything, but all I could see was Josh's phone lighting up on the counter with a picture of Bella as his wallpaper. They rushed him out, and I heard them calling ahead to the hospital about a possible hemorrhagic stroke, and the last thing I saw was Josh's still face disappearing into the ambulance, and I didn't know if Bella would ever get her daddy back. The sirens got quieter and quieter until they were gone completely, and I just stood there with my hands shaking, so bad I had to grab the counter to steady myself. Stevens slammed the door so hard the whole room shook, and his face was this scary purple color when he turned on me screaming that I was fired right now, immediately, and to get my stuff and get out of his practice forever. The other staff members were frozen in the hallway watching, but nobody said anything while Stevens kept yelling about how I'd destroyed his reputation and traumatized every patient in the waiting room with my hysteria over nothing. He grabbed Josh's chart and threw it at me saying I'd probably killed that man by causing unnecessary panic when all he needed was to calm down from his PTSD episode. My legs felt like jelly, but I picked up the chart and held it tight because I knew I'd need it later to prove what really happened in that room. Stevens followed me to the break room about 20 minutes later while I was getting my purse, and cornered me against the lockers saying he was going to file complaints with every dental board in the state and make sure I never worked in any dental office again. He said when Josh turned out fine tomorrow, I'd be paying his medical bills, plus the ambulance fees, plus damages to his practice for the chaos I'd caused with my amateur diagnosis. His spit was hitting my face while he screamed that I should clock out right now and never come back, and if I tried to get unemployment, he'd contest it with documentation of gross misconduct. I walked past him without saying anything and went straight to the computer at the front desk, where I pulled up Josh's electronic chart and started typing everything I could remember about the exact timeline. I wrote that his symptoms started at 2:47 p.m. with the eye rolling, then at 2:48 his left arm went limp, at 2:49 he had slurred speech and couldn't say Bella's name right, and at 2:51 he had complete left side paralysis. While I typed, Stevens stood behind me breathing heavy and saying I was falsifying medical records, but I kept going, documenting how he'd refused to call 911 and said it was just dental anxiety and threatened to fire me if I called for help. I pulled out my phone and opened the notes app and typed everything Stevens had said word for word, including the part about veterans with PTSD having normal trauma responses and how he'd tried to give anesthetic to someone having a stroke. Stevens tried to grab my phone, but I turned away and kept typing about how he'd called his lawyer while Josh was dying, and how he'd kept trying to do the root canal even when Josh's breathing got bad. That afternoon around 4 o'clock, I called the hospital emergency department from my car and asked for the stroke team nurse, telling her I was the dental hygienist who'd called 911 for Josh. She put me on hold for a minute, then came back and said the team really needed to know Josh's last known well time and exactly when each symptom had appeared because it affected their treatment decisions. I told her everything from my notes about the timeline, and she kept saying thank you. This is so helpful. This matters so much for his care, and asked if I could fax my documentation to them. Around 6:30 when I was home trying to eat dinner but couldn't swallow anything, my phone rang and it was Maxwell Davies, the lead paramedic who'd taken Josh to the hospital. He said he couldn't share protected health information, but wanted me to know they were treating a suspected hemorrhagic stroke, and my quick action calling 911 had mattered even though he couldn't give me details about Josh's condition. He said his crew had heard everything Stevens said about it being unnecessary unnecessary, and they'd documented it all in their run report, which would be part of the permanent record. That night, my phone buzzed with an all-staff email from Stevens calling the day's incident an example of hysteria, causing unnecessary disruption to patient care and workflow. He said everyone needed to stay silent about the false alarm because discussing it would violate HIPAA, and he was scheduling mandatory meetings for tomorrow morning to discuss proper panic attack management in dental settings. The email ended with a threat that anyone who contradicted his version of events or spoke to outside parties would face immediate termination and legal action for defamation. I couldn't sleep at all that night and just laid there staring at the ceiling, replaying that video Josh had shown me of Bella running across the airport to jump into his arms. I kept hearing him trying to say her name when his mouth wouldn't work right, and seeing his eyes full of terror because he knew he was having a stroke while Stevens pretended it was anxiety. The guilt of almost listening to Stevens and not calling 911 made me run to the bathroom and throw up twice, thinking about how I'd almost let Josh die because I was scared of losing my job. First thing the next morning at 7 a.m., I called my professional association's ethics hotline and told them everything that had happened with Stevens refusing to acknowledge a medical emergency. They said I needed to document absolutely everything and strongly consider reporting Stevens to the dental board for patient endangerment because what he'd done could have killed Josh. How did she know those exact times, like 2:47 and 2:48, when everything was happening so fast? I wonder if Josh's military training helped him stay calm, even though he must have been terrified about never seeing Bella again. When I got to work at 8:30, Pam McLeod was waiting at the door with a performance counseling form already filled out that said I'd created unnecessary chaos and undermined clinical authority during a routine patient anxiety episode. The form said I'd failed to follow proper chain of command and had damaged the practice's reputation by escalating a non-emergency situation against direct supervisory guidance. I told Pam I wouldn't sign anything without getting legal counsel because what I'd witnessed were classic stroke symptoms, not anxiety, and Josh could have died if I hadn't called 911. She shook her head and said refusing to sign would be seen as insubordination and make everything worse for me, but I still wouldn't sign that lie about what had happened to Josh. My phone started ringing around 10:30 and the screen showed the hospital's main number, making my heart jump because maybe they had news about Josh. The woman on the other end said she was Dr. Cynthia Schulte from Stroke Neurology, and she needed to talk to me about the exact timing of Josh's symptoms because it could affect his treatment plan. I grabbed my notes from my pocket where I'd been writing everything down since the ambulance left and started reading her the timeline, telling her Josh's eyes first rolled back at 9:42 and his left arm went limp at 9:44. She kept asking for more details like when exactly his speech got slurred and when the facial droop started, and I gave her every single thing I'd written down, including when Stevens tried to give him the anesthetic at 9:51. Dr. Schulte said this information was really helpful and asked if I could fax my notes to the stroke unit because the exact progression helped them understand what was happening in Josh's brain. I walked to the fax machine while still on the phone with her and sent everything over, and she thanked me 3 times for being so detailed because most people don't remember these things clearly in emergencies. She said the timing between symptom onset and treatment was critical for stroke patients, and my documentation was helping them make decisions about Josh's care. After I hung up, Stevens called me into the conference room where he'd set up what looked like an HR meeting with forms spread out on the table and Pam sitting there with a notepad. He started talking about how I'd mishandled a routine panic attack and created unnecessary chaos in the practice, pointing to printed articles about dental anxiety in veterans. Stevens said I lacked diagnostic training and needed remedial education on the difference between anxiety and medical emergencies, sliding a paper across the table that was a write-up for unprofessional conduct. I didn't touch the paper and instead asked calmly if I could get a copy of the 911 recording for my personal records since it was public information and I wanted to review the incident. Stevens' face went completely white and he stopped talking for a second, then asked why I would need that recording when we all knew what happened. I said I just wanted it for my files and mentioned that the Public Records Office could provide it within 3 business days if I filed the right paperwork. Pam looked at Stevens and I could see her realizing the recording would have me describing stroke symptoms while Stevens yelled in the background about it being unnecessary. Stevens stood up and said the meeting was over and we'd discuss this later, but his hands were shaking as he gathered up the papers he'd prepared. Around 5:30 my phone rang again, and it was Dr. Schulte calling back with an update, saying Josh definitely had a hemorrhagic stroke and had needed emergency surgery to stop the bleeding in his brain. She said the surgical team had been able to clip the bleeding vessel, but Josh's prognosis was still uncertain and the next few days would be critical. I asked if he was awake and she said not yet, that he was in the ICU on a ventilator while his brain recovered from the surgery and swelling. She thanked me again for calling 911 when I did, because every minute mattered with brain bleeds, and if he'd waited longer, the outcome would have been much worse. Right after that call, I got a text from an unknown number that turned out to be Maxwell Davies, the paramedic who'd taken Josh to the hospital. He said he wanted me to know that if the dental board asked, he'd provide a factual incident report about what he and his crew witnessed at the scene. Maxwell said they'd clearly heard Stevens refusing to acknowledge a medical emergency and trying to stop me from calling for help, and all of that was already in their official run report. He gave me his direct number and said to call if I needed anything for documentation, because paramedics are trained to recognize strokes, and what they saw was textbook symptoms, not anxiety. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and wrote out everything I could remember about what Stevens had said, using the exact words he'd used about veterans with PTSD and dental anxiety. I included his threat to fire me for practicing medicine without a license, and his comment about making me pay for the ambulance when Josh turned out to be fine. I wrote about him trying to give anesthetic to someone having a stroke and continuing to prep for the root canal while Josh was dying in the chair. The document ended up being 4 pages long with timestamps and direct quotes, and I made 3 copies to keep in different places. I couldn't sleep again, so I spent the rest of the night organizing all my documentation, including my original notes, the fax confirmation from Dr. Schulte, and Maxwell's text message. The next morning, I drove to the hospital thinking maybe I could check on Josh, or at least find out how he was doing. The ICU desk said I couldn't visit because I wasn't family, and they couldn't give me any information about his condition due to privacy rules. I left my name and phone number with the charge nurse and asked her to give it to Josh's care team in case they needed any medical history from before his stroke. On my way out, I passed the gift shop and almost bought a card, but realized Josh probably couldn't read yet if he'd just had brain surgery. When I I got back to work for the lunch shift, Pam pulled me into the supply closet and closed the door behind us, looking around like she was checking for cameras. She said in a low voice that I could make this whole thing go away if I just signed a statement saying Stevens had handled the situation appropriately and I'd overreacted to patient anxiety. She mentioned there was a small severance package available if I cooperated and agreed to keep quiet about what happened, pulling out an envelope that looked like it had cash in it. I told her I wouldn't lie about what happened when Josh almost died because Stevens refused to call for help. Pam shook her head and said I needed to think about being a team player because Stevens was already talking about cutting my hours starting next week and making my life difficult until I quit. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was eating breakfast, and it was the ethics hotline calling back about my situation. The woman on the other end told me I needed to file a formal complaint with the dental board immediately and to include only facts I could prove with documentation. She explained that patient safety concerns override any employment threats, and I had a duty to report what happened. Then she gave me the complaint form website and said to attach everything I had, including witness statements and timestamps. After hanging up, I spent the rest of the morning organizing my notes and trying to remember every single detail about Stevens refusing to call 911 while Josh was having clear stroke symptoms. That night, I couldn't sleep and kept having this nightmare where Josh was trying to say Bella's name over and over, but the words wouldn't come out and his face kept drooping more and more until it was completely slack. I woke up at 3 in the morning covered in sweat and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, knowing I had to fight this no matter what Stevens threatened because Josh almost died and other patients might be next. The fear turned into something else, like fuel that made me more determined to do the right thing even if it cost me my career. First thing in the morning, I drove to the police station where they keep dispatch records and asked the public information officer for the official timestamp of my 911 call about Josh. She pulled it up on her computer right away and printed out the record showing I'd called at exactly 2:47 p.m. reporting a suspected stroke, and she said this was public record so I could use it for any official purpose. Back home, I spread out all my documentation on the dining room table, including the dispatch record, my handwritten notes about what Stevens said, the text from Maxwell about what the paramedics witnessed, and the facts from Dr. Schulte. My hands were shaking as I typed out the formal complaint to the dental board, describing exactly what happened and how Stevens refused to acknowledge Josh's stroke symptoms while threatening to fire me if I called for help. I attached scanned copies of everything and read through it 3 more times, knowing that once I hit send, there was no going back and my whole career might change. Just as I was about to submit it, my phone rang, and it was someone from the hospital liaison office with an update about Josh. She said his surgery had successfully stopped the brain bleed and he was stable in the ICU, but the next 72 hours would be critical for determining how much function he'd be able to recover. The relief hit me so hard I had to sit down because at least Josh was alive and had a chance to see Bella again, even if we didn't know yet what his recovery would look like. An hour later, Dr. Schulte called and explained that Josh had an underlying aneurysm that ruptured during his appointment, something that could have happened anywhere, but the stress might have triggered it. I'm trying to figure out why Pam thought offering cash in a supply closet would work when someone's life was at stake. What made her think money could fix this situation? She said my quick 911 call definitely helped the triage team know what they were dealing with and get him into surgery faster, though she couldn't guarantee he'd make a full recovery. She kept thanking me for recognizing the symptoms and acting fast because those first minutes really did matter with brain bleeds. And even though Josh had a long road ahead, he at least had a fighting chance now. After we hung up, I sat there feeling guilty for even thinking about not calling 911 when Stevens first threatened me, but then I reminded myself that what mattered was that I did call, and Josh was alive because of it. I had to focus on the facts instead of the what-ifs, because beating myself up wouldn't help anyone, and I needed to stay strong to fight Stevens and protect future patients. The next morning at work, one of the other hygienists pulled me aside in the parking lot before our shift and whispered that Stevens had done this before with other emergencies. She said last year a patient complained of chest pain, and Stevens called it indigestion from lunch, refusing to let anyone call 911 until the man's wife showed up and drove him to the hospital herself where they confirmed he'd had a mild heart attack. She was too scared to speak up officially, but wanted me to know I wasn't crazy or overreacting about Stevens putting his reputation above patient safety. During our morning huddle, Pam announced that several patients had canceled their appointments after hearing rumors about what she called the incident, and she looked right at me when she said my dramatics were costing everyone hours and income. The other staff members looked uncomfortable, but nobody said anything while Pam went on about how we all needed to support the practice and not spread negativity that hurt our reputation. I kept my mouth shut and went to set up my operatory, but I could feel everyone watching me and whispering when they thought I wasn't looking. Around 2 that afternoon, Stevens called me into his office and handed me a suspension letter with a smirk on his face like he'd won something. The letter said I was suspended pending review of professional conduct for creating unnecessary disruption and undermining clinical authority during what it called a routine patient anxiety episode. He told me to clean out my locker immediately and that this was just the beginning of the consequences I'd face for my hysteria and insubordination. I walked straight to my car with the suspension letter crumpled in my hand and called my liability insurance company from the parking lot. The agent listened to everything and told me I'd done exactly the right thing by calling 911 and that patient safety always comes first. She started a claim file and said to send her copies of all my notes about what happened with Josh and Stevens' threats. I spent that whole evening at my kitchen table typing up every single detail I could remember while it was still fresh in my head. My hands were shaking as I wrote about Josh's face drooping and Stevens prepping that dental dam while Josh was dying. I documented the exact times everything happened and Stevens' exact words about PTSD and veterans having panic attacks. The insurance agent emailed me back within an hour saying my documentation was excellent and would help if Stevens tried to come after me legally. After midnight, I couldn't sleep, so I started searching online about whistleblower laws for healthcare workers in our state. I found a whole section of statutes that protect people who report patient safety issues from retaliation by their employers. I printed out every relevant law and highlighted the parts about employers not being allowed to fire or suspend workers for reporting emergencies. My printer ran out of ink halfway through, but I drove to the 24-hour store and bought more cartridges because I needed every page. I organized everything into a folder with tabs for the timeline, the laws, my insurance correspondence, and witness information. The next morning, I typed up my formal complaint to the dental board about Stevens refusing to call 911 for a stroke patient. I included every detail about Josh's symptoms and Steven's threatening my job if I called for help. I drove to the post office and sent it certified mail with return receipt requested, so I'd have proof they got it. Within 3 hours, I got an automatic email from the dental board with a case number and saying they'd review my complaint. My phone rang that afternoon and it was Maxwell, the paramedic who'd taken Josh to the hospital. He said his crew had to document everything from their call, and their observations completely matched stroke symptoms, not anxiety. He'd already submitted his standard run report to the system and said it would back up everything I was saying about Josh's condition. He gave me his direct number and said to call if I needed his statement for anything official. The hospital called the next morning with an update that made me cry with relief. Josh had been taken off the breathing machine and was starting to talk a little bit, though his words were still slurred. He had major weakness on his left side, but was following commands and recognized his family when they visited. The nurse said it was still early, but these were good signs that his brain was recovering from the bleed. That same afternoon, Pam showed up at my apartment door with a manila envelope and this fake concerned look on her face. She pushed the envelope at me saying Stevens wanted to help me through this difficult time with a severance package. I opened it right there and saw it was an NDA that basically said I was wrong about everything and promised never to talk about what happened. The money they were offering would cover 3 months of bills, which I really needed since I had no job now. But the terms said I'd have to admit I overreacted and that Stevens handled everything appropriately. I looked Pam in the eye and handed the envelope back unsigned. She actually seemed shocked and said most people would take the money and move on with their lives. I told her I wasn't most people and I wanted my final paycheck according to state law, nothing more. I went inside and got my office keys from my purse and handed them to her officially. She stood there for a minute like she couldn't believe I was turning down free money to stay quiet. After she left, I felt sick because I really did need that money, but I couldn't sign something that was a lie. That evening, Cynthia called from the hospital and asked if she could share my timing notes with Josh's treatment team. She said my documentation of exactly when his symptoms started was helping them understand his stroke timeline better. It would help them plan his rehab and figure out how much recovery was possible based on how long the bleed went on. I told her absolutely yes and emailed her everything I had written down about those terrible minutes in the dental chair. She thanked me over and over, saying this kind of precise information was invaluable for stroke patients. By the second week after getting suspended, my savings were running low and I was getting scared about paying rent. I called around to temp agencies and found one that placed dental hygienists for short-term coverage. The work was basic cleanings at different offices, nothing steady, but it would keep me from losing my apartment. I picked up 3 shifts that week at a clinic across town where nobody knew about the Stevens situation. The work felt good, normal, just cleaning teeth without any drama or emergencies. On Friday afternoon, I got a call from someone at the dental board who identified herself as the investigator assigned to my case. She sounded serious and professional, asking detailed questions about Stevens' exact response when Josh showed stroke symptoms. She wanted to know if Stevens had any emergency protocols posted, if we'd ever had emergency training, and if he'd ever dismissed medical concerns before. I told her everything, including what my coworker had said about the chest pain incident the year before. She took notes on everything and said she'd be requesting Stevens' patient records and emergency protocols as part of her investigation. She scheduled a formal recorded interview for the next morning, and I spent the night organizing my notes into a clear timeline with every detail I could remember. The investigator called exactly at 9 and started recording after reading some legal stuff about the interview being part of an official investigation. She asked me to walk through everything from the moment Josh showed symptoms, and I stuck to pure facts without any opinions or guesses about Stevens' motives. She wanted exact times for everything, like when Josh's arm went limp, when his speech got bad, when Stevens threatened to fire me, and when the paramedics arrived. She kept asking about Stevens' specific words, especially his threats about ruining my career and making me pay for the ambulance. Then she asked if Stevens had ever ignored medical emergencies before, and I told her about the coworker who mentioned the chest pain incident from last year. She asked for that coworker's name, but I explained she was scared to come forward because she still worked there. The investigator said she understood but would be sending requests to all current and former employees about Stevens' emergency response patterns. She asked if I had any written proof of Stevens' threats or the suspension, and I told her about the performance counseling form and suspension letter I'd kept. She said to send copies of everything immediately after we hung up, which I did through their secure portal. 3 days later, I was at the hospital for a temp shift when I passed the rehab unit and saw Josh through the glass doors doing physical therapy. He was in a wheelchair trying to move colored blocks from one table to another using his right hand while his left arm stayed in his lap. Wait, the dental board investigator is asking about exact times and emergency protocols? That's really smart because it shows they're looking at whether Stevens had proper safety rules in place. I wonder if dental offices have to follow the same emergency rules as hospitals do. I shouldn't have gone in, but I couldn't help myself, so I walked over slowly and his eyes lit up when he saw me. He tried to smile, but only the right side of his mouth moved and he reached out his good hand toward me. He opened his mouth and worked really hard to say something, and after a few tries, he got out, "Thank you," in this slow, careful way. His physical therapist smiled at me and said Josh had been asking about the person who called 911 since he started talking again last week. I squeezed his hand and told him Bella needed her daddy to keep working hard, and tears ran down his face, but only from his right eye. The therapist said Josh was making good progress, but had a long road ahead with his left side weakness and speech problems. I stayed for just a few more minutes watching him work with the blocks, determined to get his coordination back even though his hand shook badly. That afternoon, Maxwell texted me that the dental board had officially requested his incident report about Stevens' behavior during the emergency. He said he'd already submitted it that morning with complete honesty about Stevens trying to stop treatment and denying obvious stroke symptoms. He wrote that he'd been very clear about my appropriate recognition of stroke symptoms and Stevens' dangerous interference with emergency care. 2 days later, Pam showed up at my apartment looking exhausted and holding a box of her office stuff. She said she'd just quit Stevens' practice and couldn't work there anymore after everything that happened. She sat on my steps and admitted the pressure campaign against me was wrong, and she knew it the whole time. She said Stevens made her deliver threats and that NDA, but she couldn't keep working for someone who cared more about his reputation than Josh almost dying. She told me Stevens was getting more paranoid every day, making the staff sign new confidentiality agreements and installing cameras everywhere to monitor what people said. She said 2 other hygienists were already looking for new jobs because the atmosphere had become sounds so toxic and scary. Before she left, she apologized for her part in everything and said she'd tell the truth if the dental board contacted her. That weekend, I typed up my official resignation letter, making it clear I was leaving due to retaliation for reporting patient safety concerns. I cited the suspension, the threats, the hostile work environment, and the pressure to sign false statements about Josh's emergency. I sent it certified mail to Stevens and copied the dental board investigator, so there'd be an official record of why I left. I also mentioned my status as a whistleblower reporting dangerous medical practices and patient endangerment, using language I'd found on a legal website. 4 days later, I got an official letter from the dental board with their preliminary findings and interim action against Stevens. They were requiring him to post emergency protocols in every room, complete additional training on recognizing medical emergencies, and get second opinions for any acute symptoms. He also had to have another healthcare provider present during all procedures until the full investigation was complete, which could take months. It wasn't him losing his license like I'd hoped, but at least he couldn't ignore emergencies anymore without someone else there to stop him. That same day, Cynthia called with an update on Josh's progress and some important information about his case. She said my early 911 call definitely saved Josh's life because the hemorrhage would have been fatal if it had gone on much longer. She explained that every minute mattered with brain bleeds, and my quick action limited the damage to a survivable area of his brain. She said Josh would have significant challenges, but could eventually live independently again, which wouldn't have been possible if treatment had been delayed even 10 more minutes. 2 days later, I got a voicemail from the director of a community dental clinic saying she'd heard about my situation through professional channels. She said they valued employees who put patient safety first and wanted someone with my integrity on their team. I called back immediately, and she invited me for an interview, mentioning they had excellent emergency protocols and regular training for all staff. The interview went great, and she offered me the position on the spot with better pay than Stevens ever gave me. My first day at the new clinic started with a mandatory emergency drill where everyone practiced recognizing different types of medical crises. The director had us run through stroke symptoms, heart attack signs, allergic reactions, and seizure protocols with fake scenarios and mannequins. She said they did these drills monthly because dental offices saw more medical emergencies than people realized. Everyone took it seriously, discussing how they'd handled real emergencies in the past and what they'd learned from each experience. The atmosphere was completely different from Stevens' practice, where he acted like emergencies were inconveniences that interrupted his schedule. Week 8, after Josh's stroke, I got permission to visit him officially at the rehab center as the hygienist who called 911. When I walked into his room, a woman jumped up and grabbed my hands with tears streaming down her face. She introduced herself as Layla, Josh's ex-wife, and thanked me over and over for saving him when his boss wouldn't help. Bella was at a small table coloring with crayons, and she looked up at me with Josh's same brown eyes before going back to her picture. Josh shifted in his wheelchair and reached his good arm toward Bella, who jumped up from her coloring and grabbed his right hand with both of her tiny ones. His mouth worked hard to form the words, and finally he got out, "Bella," clear as day. Then, "I love you," came out slower, but just as clear. Bella pressed her face against his hand and started crying happy tears, while Layla rubbed Josh's shoulder and told him how proud she was of his progress. The physical therapist came in and showed us the charts of Josh's improvement over the past weeks, pointing out how his left leg was starting to respond to commands, even though his left arm was still mostly dead. Josh pushed himself up using his right arm and managed to stand for almost 30 seconds with the therapist spotting him, and Bella clapped like he'd just won the Olympics. Later that week, I got an email from Pam with news about Stevens that made me feel like maybe justice actually existed sometimes. The dental board had ordered him into mandatory risk management training 3 days a week for the next 6 months, and his patient schedule was cut in half while they finished their full investigation. 3 other hygienists from his practice had filed complaints after mine went public, describing times Stevens ignored chest pain, allergic reactions, and even a patient who passed out cold. The board investigator called to tell me their preliminary findings showed a pattern of negligence, and my documentation had been crucial in establishing the timeline. 2 weeks later, the rehab center held their annual fundraiser in the hospital cafeteria, selling baked goods and raffle tickets to raise money for new equipment. I was buying cookies when Maxwell walked up and asked how I was doing after everything that happened. We talked for maybe 5 minutes about Josh's progress and how he was getting stronger every day, and Maxwell said his crew still talked about that call and how my quick thinking saved Josh's life. He bought some brownies and we went our separate ways, keeping it professional since we both knew the whole situation was still under investigation. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and filed away all my documents from the case into a folder marked with a date and Josh's initials. The 911 call timestamp, my handwritten notes from that day, the dental board correspondence, everything went into that folder before I sealed it and put it in my filing cabinet. I opened my phone and set a monthly reminder to review emergency protocols at my new clinic, making sure I'd never freeze up if something like this happened again. Josh was alive and getting better every day. Bella had her daddy back even if he moved slower now. I had a job where patient safety actually mattered, and Stevens couldn't dismiss emergencies anymore with the board watching his every move. Thanks for hanging out and exploring all this with me today. Really fun to wonder through it together. I'll see you soon. And hey, like the video, it helps more than you think.